Jonathan Hayes had built his life on power, control, and a relentless pursuit of success. His name was synonymous with luxury high-rises and sprawling developments, a testament to his ability to turn anything into gold. But to him, land was nothing more than numbers on a ledger, an asset to be bought, sold, and conquered. That's exactly what brought him to Willow Haven, a quiet farm nestled between rolling fields, one of the last untouched pieces of land in the region. It was supposed to be a simple transaction. A signature, a handshake, and the land would be his. But as he stepped onto the worn wooden porch of the farmhouse, something unexpected happened. The scent of fresh earth and wild lavender lingered in the air, a strange contrast to the cold steel and glass towers he was used to. The door creaked open, and he was met not with fear or desperation, but with defiance. Elena Sterling, the farm's owner, stood tall, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Hayes. This land isn't for sale." Jonathan was unfazed. He had faced resistance before. But then, his eyes drifted past her, into the dimly lit room beyond. And that's when his world tilted. Hanging on the wall, above a simple wooden mantel, was a framed photograph. The sight of it struck him harder than any negotiation ever had. His breath caught in his throat. The face staring back at him was one he had spent decades trying to forget. Isabella Sterling, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had disappeared without a trace. In that moment, everything changed. The deal, the land, the power he wielded. It all faded into the background. Questions stormed through his mind, unraveling years of certainty. What had happened to Isabella? Why had she vanished? And more importantly, why was her daughter, the daughter he never knew existed, standing before him now, fighting to hold onto a farm that should have meant nothing to him, yet suddenly meant everything? This was no longer just a business transaction. It was the beginning of a truth he was never meant to uncover. And as the weight of the past settled over him, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. Walking away was no longer an option. There are moments in life that force us to face what we've buried deep, moments that demand we choose between who we were and who we could become. If you want to uncover the truth with Jonathan, explore the unexpected twists of fate, and see how one discovery can change everything, don't miss what's coming next. Stay with us because this is just the beginning. Jonathan Hayes stood frozen, his entire world tilting as he stared at the photograph on the wall. The past, which he had spent years burying under layers of ambition and wealth, had just crashed into his present with breathtaking force. Isabella Sterling. The name alone had the power to unravel him. He had searched for her once, desperate for answers, but time had worn down that longing into something colder, acceptance, or at least the illusion of it. Yet here she was, staring back at him through time, unchanged by the years that had carved deep lines into his own reflection. Elena watched him carefully, her arms crossed over her chest, wary yet defiant. The resemblance was undeniable. The sharpness of her gaze, the quiet strength in her posture, the way she stood her ground just like Isabella once had. It was like seeing a ghost, except this ghost was flesh and blood, standing right in front of him. His voice came out unsteady, stripped of the authority he had carried into this place. "Where did you get that?" Elena hesitated, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something vulnerable, as if she was bracing herself for an answer she wasn't ready to give. Then finally she spoke. "She was my mother." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Jonathan staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the worn wooden railing as if it could steady him. The weight of what she had just said settled over him, suffocating and impossible. His mind raced, piecing together the impossible. If Isabella was her mother, then that meant, no, couldn't be. His breath turned shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. She never told me." His voice was barely above a whisper, thick with something he couldn't name. Elena studied him with a mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to resentment. "Maybe she didn't trust you." The words stung sharper than they should have. He had spent years convincing himself that Isabella had left by choice, that whatever they had shared wasn't enough to hold her. But hearing that she might have kept something this important from him, it made the past shift in ways he wasn't prepared for. His jaw tightened as his mind fought against the rising tide of questions. Why had she left? Why had she never reached out? And if she had been pregnant, if she had carried his child, then why had she raised her daughter alone? He looked at Elena again, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw more than just resistance. He saw a lifetime without answers. A lifetime of questions she had likely asked herself every day. A lifetime of growing up without a father who had never even known she existed. And beneath the defiance, beneath the walls she had clearly built to protect herself, he saw something else, something painfully familiar. Loneliness struck him then, deep and unrelenting. He had spent so many years chasing success, thinking it would fill the void Isabella had left behind. But now, standing here, faced with the daughter he never knew, he realized he had been running from something far greater. He hadn't just lost Isabella. He had lost an entire lifetime he could never get back. His voice was quieter this time, the sharp edges gone. What happened to her? Elena's expression flickered, and for the first time, her shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her. She disappeared when I was 5. Her voice was steady, but there was a rawness underneath, a wound that had never truly healed. No one ever found out why. Jonathan swallowed hard. The grief in her voice was something he recognized, something he had once felt himself. But now it wasn't just about the woman they had both lost. It was about the years that had been stolen from them both. The land, the business deal, the life he had walked in here expecting to claim. It all felt meaningless now, because he hadn't just found a piece of his past. He had found something far more valuable. And for the first time in decades, Jonathan Hayes wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about what it meant to belong. Jonathan Hayes had always prided himself on being a man who controlled his own fate. There were no unsolved mysteries in his life, no loose ends left to haunt him. At least that's what he had convinced himself. But standing in that farmhouse, staring into the unwavering eyes of Elena Sterling, he felt the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions pressing down on him like a storm cloud ready to break. Isabella had disappeared. That much he had accepted. But now, for the first time, he had to confront the one truth he had never considered. She hadn't just vanished. She had been hiding something. And that something was standing right in front of him. His mind raced back to the last time he had seen her. The night that had replayed in his memory so many times it had lost all its edges, worn down to nothing but fragments. The warmth of her laughter, the way her hand had lingered in his for just a second too long before she turned away. The promise in her eyes, one that was never fulfilled. He had spent years trying to make sense of it, drowning himself in work, in deals, in the kind of power that made people forget they had ever been powerless. But now he knew the truth. Someone had stolen their future before it had ever begun. Elena's voice pulled him back. I looked for answers too, she said, her tone quieter now, almost reluctant. For years. But every time I got close, it was like someone had already erased the trail. Jonathan clenched his fists. He knew that feeling well. After Isabella disappeared, he had searched. He had hired investigators, scoured records, chased rumors. But no matter where he turned, it was as if she had never existed. At first, he had thought she had simply left him. Then, after enough time passed, he told himself that maybe she had needed a fresh start, something he couldn't give her. But what if it had never been her choice? He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as a realization settled over him like ice creeping into his bones. Someone didn't want me to find her, he said, more to himself than to Elena. She studied him carefully, her arms still crossed, but something in her posture had shifted, less defiant, more uncertain. Why would anyone care if you found her? Jonathan didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew that whoever had taken Isabella from him all those years ago had done more than just make her disappear. They had buried something dangerous enough that it was worth keeping a secret. His pulse pounded as the pieces started falling into place. If Isabella had been pregnant when she vanished, if she had left not because she wanted to, but because she had to, Then she had been running from something. Or someone. His gut twisted at the thought. All these years, he had been searching for a woman who never left by choice. And now, standing in the only place that still held traces of her, he realized he had been blind. He had been looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions. The answer had never been in the past. It had always been here, in the present, waiting for him in the eyes of the daughter he had never known. Elena shifted slightly, and for the first time, he saw something flicker beneath the guarded exterior she had built around herself. Doubt, hope, fear. Maybe she was just as uncertain as he was about what this meant, about who he was supposed to be to her now. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I need to know what happened to her, he said, his voice steady now. And I think you do too. Elena didn't respond right away. Instead, she held his gaze, as if weighing something. Trust didn't come easily, he knew that. But this wasn't just about trust. This was about truth. Finally, she nodded. Then we start looking. For the first time in 25 years, Jonathan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Elena Sterling had spent her whole life fighting for this land. Not because it was just a farm, not because it was the last piece of her mother she had left, but because it was the only thing that had ever truly felt like home. She had poured everything she had into it. The sweat of early mornings, the quiet prayers whispered to the soil, the hope that if she held on long enough, maybe she would finally understand why her mother had fought so hard to keep it. And now, standing before the man who had almost taken it from her, she wondered if he was beginning to see it too. Jonathan Hayes wasn't the same man who had stepped onto her land hours earlier. He had arrived with power in his voice, certainty in his stride. He had come as a conqueror, ready to buy and bulldoze without a second thought. But now his world had shifted. She could see it in the way his eyes lingered on the farmhouse, in the hesitation of his movements. He wasn't just looking at property anymore. He was looking at something far more fragile, something he had lost without ever knowing he had it. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. She loved this place. Elena nodded, feeling the familiar ache rise in her chest. It was everything to her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon sun stretched golden fingers across the wheat fields, painting the land in warmth. The wind carried the scent of earth and rain, and for the first time, Jonathan truly let himself take it in. He had spent his entire life in boardrooms and cities where nature was something controlled, manicured, placed in decorative pots at the edge of steel and glass towers. But here, everything was wild and untouched, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it made him feel small. He looked at Elena again, this time with something different in his gaze. She never told me why she left, he said. I thought she just... He stopped, shaking his head. I don't know what I thought anymore. Elena studied him, searching for the man her mother had once loved. She had spent years resenting him without ever knowing him, building him up in her mind as the villain of her mother's story. But now, seeing the weight he carried, the way his jaw tightened every time he said Isabella's name, she realized something else. He wasn't just a man who had lost someone. He was a man who had never been given the chance to understand why. She let out a slow breath and stepped toward the old wooden bench on the porch, motioning for him to sit. For the first time since he had arrived, he did as she asked without question. When I was little, she said, keeping her voice steady, she used to sit out here every evening. She'd hum while she watched the fields, like she was singing to the land itself. She hesitated, then added, she was happy here, even when things were hard, even when the farm was barely holding together. Jonathan rested his elbows on his knees, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them against something unseen. And she never told you about me? Elena shook her head. She never talked about the past. I didn't even know your name until I found some old letters she kept. She swallowed. She didn't run because of you, if that's what you're thinking. Jonathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders shifting, but not disappearing entirely. Then why?
Elena hesitated.
She had asked herself the same question 1,000 times. Why had her mother been so afraid? Why had she locked the doors at night, kept a baseball bat by her bedside, flinched at shadows that weren't there? I don't know, she admitted, but I think she was protecting me from something. Jonathan's grip tightened. That single thought that Isabella had been afraid made something inside him coil. He had been angry for years, believing she had abandoned him, believing she had chosen another life over the one they had planned. But what if she hadn't been given a choice? His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to shift to shades of deep orange and violet. For years, he had been building things, skyscrapers, businesses, an empire designed to keep him moving forward. But here, in this quiet place that still carried traces of the woman he had once loved, he realized something else. He had spent his whole life chasing a future, but maybe, just maybe, his past had been waiting for him all along. Jonathan Hayes had always believed that success was measured in numbers, profit margins, square footage, the weight of a deal closing in his favor. He had spent his life building something tangible, something that proved he had control over his own fate. But now, as he sat on the porch of a farmhouse that wasn't his, listening to the quiet resolve in Elena Sterling's voice, he realized just how much of his own life had been written without him. He had come here to take, to claim, to erase. Instead, he had found something he had been searching for his entire life without even knowing it. The land stretched before them, golden and endless, whispering in the wind like a story waiting to be told. It had been Isabella's sanctuary, the place she had chosen to build a life far away from the world he had once promised her. And yet, despite all the questions that still lingered, he couldn't ignore the feeling pressing against his chest. The undeniable truth that what had mattered most to her had never been money, never been ambition. It had been this: a home, a daughter, a love that had never faded, even in silence. He turned to Elena, seeing the weight she carried in the set of her shoulders, in the way she spoke of her mother like she was still trying to understand the echoes of her choices. She had spent her life fighting to keep this place alive, to hold on to something that had always been bigger than just land. And now, for the first time in his life, Jonathan understood what it meant to fight for something that couldn't be measured. "I don't want to take this from you," he said finally, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He had never been a man to back down, never been someone who walked away from a deal. But this wasn't a deal anymore. This was something else entirely. Elena's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then why are you still here?" Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if trying to ground himself. "Because I think I finally understand why your mother left." He met her gaze, steady now. "And because I don't think this land should be another thing that gets erased." The skepticism in her face softened just slightly, but she still didn't trust him. Not yet. He couldn't blame her. Trust wasn't something that could be bought or negotiated. It had to be earned. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he was willing to do the work. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What if we do something different?" Elena frowned. "Like what?" "I have resources, connections. You have history here, roots. What if instead of turning this land into another development, we build something that lasts? Something that honors what your mother wanted?" Elena studied him carefully, her fingers tightening slightly around the railing. "You don't get to undo the past by throwing money at it." Jonathan nodded. "I know, but I do know how to build things. And I know that this place means more than just old soil and memories. If you want to fight to keep it, let me help." She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse outright. But then she looked past him, out into the fields, and he saw something flicker in her expression. Uncertainty, yes, but also something that looked a lot like hope. For years, she had been fighting alone, holding onto a legacy that had begun long before her. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Jonathan didn't know what this meant yet, didn't know what it would take to make things right. But he did know one thing. He had come here believing he was closing a deal. Instead, he was opening a door to something far greater. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about what it meant to stay. The past had always been something Jonathan Hayes kept at a safe distance. Something buried under the weight of ambition. Locked away behind the steel and glass towers he built to insulate himself from anything that felt too real, too raw. But here, in this quiet place where the echoes of Isabella still lingered, he could no longer ignore the truth staring back at him. This wasn't just about land, and it never had been. It was about the years that had been stolen, the life he never got to live, the daughter he never knew he had. Elena had spent her whole life searching for pieces of a mother who had left too soon, holding on to this farm like it was the last thread connecting her to the woman who had raised her. And now, in the most unexpected way, she had found something else. Something she had never dared to believe she would have. A father. Not just a name, not just a ghost from a story she was never told, but a living, breathing man who had been just as lost as she had been. She didn't know what to do with that yet, and neither did he. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in the deep amber glow of twilight, Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There were no easy answers here. He couldn't change the past, couldn't erase the pain of what had been lost. But maybe, just maybe, he could be part of what came next. Elena had found something tucked away in an old chest in the farmhouse. A bundle of letters Isabella had never sent. Letters filled with words Jonathan had never been meant to read. In them, she had written about him, about the love they once shared, about the life she had dreamed of before everything had been taken from them. And in those words, he found the answer he had been searching for all these years. Isabella had never stopped loving him. She had never left because she wanted to. She had left because she had no choice. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, the weight of that realization settling deep in his chest. He had spent years chasing success, thinking it would fill the void Isabella had left behind. But the truth was, he had been searching for something far greater. And now he had found it not in the past but in the present. In the daughter who stood before him. In the legacy that still remained. He turned to Elena, his voice steady, his decision made. "I don't want to leave this unfinished." She looked at him, searching his face for something she wasn't sure she would find. But there was no hesitation in his gaze, no doubt in his words. He meant it. For so long, she had thought she was alone in this fight. But now, for the first time, she wasn't. Jonathan wasn't here to take. He wasn't here to win. He was here to stay. And maybe that was the beginning of something neither of them had ever expected. Jonathan Hayes had come to Willow Haven believing he was closing a deal, that this land, like so many before it, would be another piece of his empire. But in the end, it wasn't the land he had claimed. It was something far more valuable. He had spent decades living in the shadow of a past he never truly understood, believing that Isabella had left him by choice, that the life they had once dreamed of had simply slipped away. But now he knew the truth. She had never abandoned him. She had been forced to disappear, to protect the one thing more precious than their love, their daughter. And that daughter, the fierce and determined Elena Sterling, had spent her life holding on to the only piece of her mother she had left, never knowing that the other half of her story had been searching for answers just as desperately. Jonathan had built skyscrapers, bought entire city blocks, reshaped skylines. But here, among the golden fields that once carried Isabella's laughter, he realized that true legacy wasn't measured in profits or power. It was measured in the lives we touch, the love we fight for, and the people we refuse to walk away from. So he stayed, not as a businessman looking to claim what wasn't his, but as a father trying to rebuild something that had been stolen from them both. Together, he and Elena transformed Willow Haven, not into another development, but into something even greater. A place where people could come not just to work the land, but to heal. A place where history wasn't erased, but honored. A place where the past and the future finally met. Because in the end, it wasn't about what they had lost. It was about what they had found. And maybe that's a lesson we can all take with us. In life, we chase so many things. Success, wealth, status, thinking they will bring us fulfillment. But sometimes, the most valuable things are the ones we almost overlook. Love, family, the connections that make us who we are. It's never too late to right a wrong, to search for the truth, to fight for what truly matters. So ask yourself, what are you holding on to? What legacy do you want to leave behind? And most importantly, are you willing to fight for it? If this story moved you, If it made you think, if you've ever felt the weight of the past or the hope of second chances, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, share your own experiences, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that just might change the way you see the world. Because sometimes the stories that matter most aren't just the ones we tell. They're the ones we live.